Welcome to this 206th edition of Europe Calling. In cooperation with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, I would like to give a special welcome to our guests today, who you can already see here, and who I will introduce in more detail in a moment. My name is Maximilian. I'm the Managing Director of Europe Calling, and it is my pleasure to moderate this evening. We will mainly be speaking German today. For those who need English interpretation, I will say that again in English.
So welcome to this 206th episode of Europe Calling. Today we will speak mostly in German. If you need English interpretation, please check out the little globe in the control panel and choose English. And thank you very much to our interpreters, Leon and Maren, who are helping us today with that. Und dann geht's wieder zurück ins Deutsche.
Back to German. And I have a few short announcements to make. Now, firstly, what we can expect this evening, I will show you now on this slide. We will start by an input by Jakob Schwörer from the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Then we'll have some time for direct questions, and after that we'll speak about the effects on society and politics with Judith Kohlenberger, Hakan Demir, and Nursemin Sönmez. Annette will be explaining this in more detail afterwards. And afterwards, we'll have time for your questions. You can see the QR code here. Simply scan this QR code now. When it comes to the questions at Europe Calling, you can always assess the questions of others with a thumbs up. We expect to have about 800-900 participants. We have 1,700 registrations, so we want to discuss the questions that are particularly important to you. So do vote on other persons' questions so that we can pose the questions that everyone finds the most important. And please use your name when posing your question, so that I don't have to invent a name. And Europe Calling is being recorded and will then be made available as a podcast and as a YouTube video. So take that into consideration when you ask your questions. That will be it for my initial announcements. I'll now give the floor to Annette Schlicht from the Global Policy and Development Department. She was previously head of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Nepal and Benin and was responsible for the area of migration and participation in the Political Education Department of the Foundation in Berlin. Dear Annette, thank you very much for the great cooperation here for this webinar. You now have the floor. Thank you very much, dear Max, for this kind introduction and, of course, for the pleasant cooperation. Well, what are we going to be talking about today? Not a day goes by without the topic of migration and asylum being in the news or publicly discussed. And the tone of the debate is clearly one of increasing restriction. It is about deterrence and sealing oneself off, not only in Germany, but throughout Europe, be it at the beginning of the year with the negotiations on the reform of the European asylum system, be it on the occasion of the elections to the European Parliament and to the state parliament elections in East Germany, or be it in the discussion about the security package of the federal government as a reaction to the Islamist-motivated attacks in Solingen. And of course, migration policy is a central policy area for right-wing parties, a key issue, so to speak. It is constructed as a central context of action under which almost everything can be subsumed. Failures in social policy, a lack of living space, security, policy problems, the plight of education policy, and of course the state's loss of control, as well as much more. Restrictive migration policy seems to be the central answer to all pressing matters, according to the right-wing parties. And this discourse has also been taken up more and more recently by centrist parties, including the argument that a restrictive migration policy takes the wind out of the sails of the right and thereby ultimately saves democracy. What an argument. More deportations, the reduction of services, of course, has fatal consequences for refugees, for people who have applied for asylum or want to apply, but ultimately, it also changes the way we live together, our language and our society. How that happens and what we can do about it is what we want to discuss this evening with very interesting guests, some of whom have already been introduced. More about that later, but you can see them already on stage. The title of the event is Migration Nordic Style. Well, because for a few years now, and again this year, a lot of people are looking at Scandinavia. Many people are especially looking at Denmark. And almost all European countries have now entered into the asylum policy underbidding competition. But in Denmark, the so-called paradigm change was passed in 2019. And ever since, all Danish governments have been following this approach. Zero asylum seekers is the official goal of the Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen. But what exactly this means? What is the Danish or Nordic restrictive migration policy? What is the effect on the parties and on society? I'm pleased that Jakob Schwörer will now be providing us with an input. He is a policy advisor at the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Stockholm, and his work focuses, among other things, on party behavior and migration and integration policy in Northern Europe. And together with another colleague, he published an exciting paper at the beginning of the year with the title Success Story or Pitfall, the Danish Social Democratic Party and its Migration Policy. Jakob, we look forward to your input. Thank you, Annette. I am just going to try to share my screen.
So, das müsste hoffentlich funktionieren. Sehr gut.
Okay, hopefully this works. As announced, I will be speaking about the Danish migration and asylum policy, especially since 2019, when this restrictive law was passed. 2015, there was already a sort of shift in the migration policy, but it became particularly restrictive in the framework of the reform in 2019. At the end of my presentation, I will also briefly speak about the so-called ghetto law, which is not directly linked to the migration policy. It's a law of its own, but there is a timely correlation, and the result of it has also been that many cultural groups have a more difficult time in Danish society. Now let's start with asylum and migration policy. There was this paradigm shift in 2019. That is the term often used for this legal reform. Now in Denmark, this is possible because when it comes to migration policy, it is not bound by EU law and has a so-called opt-out when it comes to the EU directives. A few words about the basics. This might appear somewhat dry, but it's important to understand what this change, what this shift actually means, also to understand the consequences.
Sammelband genau zu dem Thema, die Folgen der dänischen Asyl-Migrationspolitik seit 2019. Und ich werde mich so ein bisschen
dealing with this topic, and in my presentation, I will also focus on the topics we are treating in a book that we aim to publish soon. What happened in 2019? Well, a temporary status of protection was expanded to everyone seeking protection. So a maximum of 2 years of temporary protection is now the rule. And this status has to be renewed every time, but it can also be revoked at any time. And this when there's a reassessment of the situation in the home country. So if there is the assessment that there has been a slight improvement, this protection status can be revoked. And this has often been subject to criticism. This is something that is being done regularly. So as someone seeking protection, you have this temporary leave to remain, but you cannot be sure that you will be able to stay for that entire period. So the situation for these people is rather uncertain. And then another thing that is perhaps even more relevant is the following. With this reform, it is much more difficult to stay for a longer period in Denmark. So the issue is that you are bound by time. There's no real prospect of staying in the long run. There's this insecurity because you only have temporary leave to remain without the prospect of this changing in due time. What's also new is that integration achievements no longer count when it comes to the assessment of the protection status. If you want to extend your protection status, these types of integration achievements are no longer of validity. For example, if you speak Danish or are active on the labor market. So you cannot increase the likelihood of obtaining the right to remain in the long term. And as you have said, Annette, the goal is to deter. The goal is that fewer and fewer people want to come to Denmark because of this restrictive migration policy. In this legal package, the term integration was also deleted, and it was replaced by the terms of repatriation and perhaps to provide a little more context, 8 years until you can apply for permanent leave to remain. Even within Northern Europe, this is quite a long time. In the other countries, it is 3 to 4 years. So Denmark is quite unique with these 8 years.
Effekte, das ist so der nächste Punkt. Was hat es jetzt für Konsequenzen für die Betroffenen selbst?
Now moving on to the effects. In our book, we have 2 chapters on this.
Und man kann sich vielleicht schon ein bisschen vorstellen, man kann durch eigene Integrationsleistungen nichts an seiner Situation mehr verändern.
Well, you can't really change your situation through any achievements. You only have a temporary leave to remain that can be withdrawn. If the assessment of the country of origin changes,
es verursacht eine Art von Ohnmachtsgefühl, weil man eben in dieser Situation gefangen ist.
This, of course, causes a psychological hardship.
Geflüchteten Frauen.
In our book, we also have a chapter about women on the move, because the situation for women is often even more precarious than for men. I can only speak about this superficially now. That's because of the protection status being more precarious. Women don't have to do a military service in the country, so they have even less of a protection status and therefore depend on the protection status of their partner. And this is also what the chapter in our book shows. Women are almost scared to separate from violent men because they're scared of being stripped of their protection status. There are reports.
Wir haben auch Interviews mit Caseworkern, also mit Menschen, die mit Schutz
There are reports of many suicide attempts. We also have caseworkers that have given us reports.
Dafür sorgen sollen, dass Schutzsuchende sich selbst versorgen können.
And the idea is also for the people to be able to provide for themselves and learn the language. And the interviews have also shown that there's a lot of resignation here. Because now you cannot say, okay, learn Danish and look for a job.
Darüber hinaus müssen jetzt
then you will have the prospect of staying because this no longer exists.
Integrationsarbeiter, die so oft
Now, these integration workers
per Gesetz
that often work for the municipality are forced to promote leaving the country in the discussions. So in these discussions, they need to tell the people, please learn Danish and look for a job, but please leave the country as quickly as possible. We don't really want you there. So this is a sort of contradictory message. It certainly doesn't motivate, and it certainly doesn't lead to people identifying with the country. Financial means were also cut.
Radikal gekürzt tatsächlich.
Indeed, the financial resources have been radically cut. There are studies that show that this can lead to more theft, to small-scale crime, because you're no longer able to take care of yourself, because you simply do not have sufficient resources. It also, by the way, increases dropouts in school. This was sort of in a nutshell the state of affairs. I don't have a whole lot of time left, but perhaps one further point that I find interesting, and that is the goal of deportations. That is the official goal. Now, this protection status is often or more increasingly withdrawn or no longer prolonged. That is something that can already be empirically observed. Of course, because the situation in the country of origin is reassessed. One thing that you cannot see is that the amount of deportations has risen dramatically. We have figures from the deportation centers in 2021. 653 people left the deportation center. 74 of whom left Denmark, went back to their country of origin, so very few. 78 received another protection status, and 419 are now depicted as having disappeared, listed as absent, so to speak. These are people that have had their protection status revoked. You can't deport them for different reasons. For example, because there isn't a diplomatic tie with the country of origin. So now they're listed as absent in the statistics, and the authorities also do not know where they are. It is presumed that they go to Sweden and to Germany to get by, but we don't really know. That is the consequence of this illegality, because the goal is, of course, to revoke this status as quickly as possible. And because you cannot deport, it leads to this illegality.
So, ich folge so ein bisschen den Themen in unserem Sammelband. Ein weiterer Punkt ist so der Effekt
Another point is the effect on the asylum seeker numbers. That's always the central argument. The Danish say we have very few asylum seekers because of our restrictive asylum and migration policy. In 2019, this legal reform took place. We see that the number went down slightly. That's mainly because of the COVID pandemic. That led to less mobility, then it slightly went up during the Ukraine war. And then it is often said that in 2015 there was also a reform of the Asylum Act in Denmark. And that's true here, the numbers go down quite drastically. However, if you use the same time frame and take a look at other countries, if you take a look at how the asylum seeker numbers have developed in these other countries, in countries that didn't implement the same type of paradigm shift, well, we can see that Denmark is comparable to the other countries. There seems to be a general trend in all of the Northern European countries. Denmark is comparable to the other countries here. So there's little reason to assume that the migration policy has led to these figures going down, because it seems to be more of a general trend after 2015.
Another effect is that of the system of parties and its radical right. What we hear them say is that, yes, we've managed. Actually, the radical, the extreme right doesn't play a role anymore, because the left or center parties are taking care of that. So the traditional party at the center, Volksparty, has indeed lost many votes recently. However, when looking at the right turn that our standard parties are taking, migration issues always play a major role, and a moderate part of the former right-wing electors have turned to the Social Democrats. Almost 10%. That's what was estimated. So the former voters of the right-wing Danish party. But there are many studies from international journals who were observing this sort of migration of voters, and also looked at the reasons, what motivated them to join the Social Democrats, leaving the radical, the extreme right. Well, actually, their social and economic policy, because Social Democrats have slowly moved to the left. And at the same time, Social Democrats couldn't really convince those voters who are very critical of the migration policy and the migration situation. So what we've seen here is that it's not quite true if they say that they sort of caught right-wing voters. Looking at the history, the time frame, what we're still looking at is the fact that the Danish Popular Party, they only have 5%. They are the right extremists. However, there is a new right-wing party, the Denmark's Democrats. It's basically a textbook example of a right-wing party. Even in political science, there's hardly any debates about that, because it's clearly stated as a national and authoritarian party. Now, looking at the survey results on these parties, they have about 15% in Denmark. So comparing this to the existing election results in Denmark, that is to say, votes and elections that brought the right extremist, the right-wing parties into parliament, actually, this is the worst result ever since 2015. So you could easily argue to say that the radical right, the extreme right, now is particularly strong. Not just briefly. Well, it's hard to show up the causes and to explain that both are linked. You know, people turning to the extreme right, and this having to do with migrants. Traditionally, the Social Democrats, but also the Venstre party, the new party of moderate Danish voters. You still have to see that the Social Democrats lost many votes in the European elections, and same goes for the Green. The Venstre party lost votes massively. And also the neoliberal party is gaining votes. This is the yellow line, by the way. The Liberal party is not really turning down. However, at the moment, the winners are the Greens and also the radical right, but we haven't seen any stable results here ever since there was this turn to the extreme right in migration issues. So it's not been stable. It's maybe just that the governing party is just not very popular, and its coalition, they're very unpopular. But we cannot confirm that the moderate parties had benefited in any way from politics turning to the right. Just briefly, an overview, and I'll say something about the so-called ghetto legislation. Ever since 1919, this very precarious protection status was extended to all refugees and asylum seekers, and this has consequences for those who are concerned. They feel totally helpless. More people, more migrants try and kill themselves. They try to commit suicide. So there really is a clear link. That is the cause, the legislation and people trying to take their lives. I'd even go as far and say that these self-imposed targets, they were not achieved by Denmark. So we can't say there is no evidence, there is no reason to believe that this very hardline asylum policy would have curbed the number of asylum seekers and deportations. So when they say the democratic parties that benefited, this is what we cannot see, and and the radical right is not weakened. When you take a closer look, there's a very sobering result and conclusion. Well, that is my conclusion anyhow. Now, so this is the paradigm shift that we saw 2019. This is just a wild chase through the legislation and its consequences, as I can explain in the 20 or 30 minutes here. The ghetto legislation, as I say, is not directly linked to migration policy. It's a separate package of laws on migration happening more or less in parallel. And this has an impact on certain cultural groups. The aim being to avoid so-called ghettos, of course, and to make sure that they no longer exist, abolish ghettos in Denmark, but also to make the parts of towns more heterogeneous. And what we also see in Denmark is that there is a certain body that is therefore classify areas as vulnerable areas, and in terms of vulnerable housing, the level of education, revenue, compared to the average income. Now, looking, if some of these factors are given, then the Danish would talk of a vulnerable housing area, but this would not lead to any tangible measures that would be taken from the state or from authorities. This can only happen if there's another factor, and this is the very critical factor, that a minimum of 50% of inhabitants of this vulnerable housing area need to have a non-Western migration background. In that case, it's not just called a vulnerable housing area, it's called a ghetto. So, and up until 2021, it literally said ghetto. Now the language has been changed, it's called parallel society. That is the classification. So let me repeat, a non-Western migration background, migration history, that is the condition that would result in an area of town called a parallel society. So it's not just refugees and migrants. This includes Danish citizens. They might have a Danish passport, but they might have non-Western roots. And there's a whole list of criteria, what is called non-Western roots. So Danish citizens will be concerned. So what is the consequence? There is a classification as a parallel society. As I said, until 2021, it was called ghetto. Now, let's say the situation doesn't change within 5 years. The area of town is still falls under the classification of ghetto, or now parallel society. It's called area of transformation. And that is to say that the number of public housing units must be reduced to below 40%, or to 40% at least, by demolition or sale. And what often happens is that people are resettled. They would be moved or relocated to other housing units in other areas of town. Now, and this is the red hot issue. This affects people with non-Western backgrounds, because you need to get below these 50% to no longer be called a ghetto or parallel society. And this is not just in theory, happening in theory. We're looking at practice here. We have a number of case studies and examples in our anthology of an area within Copenhagen where people will be relocated. They need to leave their homes, their social networks, and are forced to move to different apartments in a different place, in a different quarters of the city or town. And this has been criticized by the United Nations, the fact that a non-Western background presents a risk factor defined by law. So even if people are low in employment, their education rate is low, etc. But the fact that Western people live there wouldn't be called a ghetto. It is only when more than 50% of inhabitants have a non-Western background. And just very briefly, let me add something. I'd like to leave some time for the discussion. I'm sure you'll have questions. I did my best here to explain the two legal packages. Packages of legal acts, and I hope that helped. I'll hand the floor back to Annette. Yes, that's great. Thank you, Jakob. I could follow you very well. And I see there's a number of questions that popped up, so thank you very much to our listeners, to the audience. Keep liking contributions or keep asking questions. Now, you are talking about the anthology, the omnibus volume, which has not been published yet, so that is not what you can put in as a link, but there was another paper you published in February, so you might want to post that. That might be interesting to some of our participants. Now, I can see there's a whole range of questions. So, legal migration, immigration to Denmark. One question, for example, an anonymous participant asked the following question. With offering jobs, or having received a job offer, or having certain skills and qualifications, can people come to Denmark? Or people who have a protected status, are they allowed to work, to do paid work in Denmark? Perhaps you could say a word on that. Yes, indeed, people under the protected status are allowed to work, and the Danish want them to work so that they're autonomous. They're self-sufficient, but let's say there are associations of employers. They're having an issue with this. Often they feel it's not a good idea to employ those with a protected status because they don't know whether their employees will still be in the country after 12 months or so. I'm not sure if there's a certain deadline, but yes, the idea behind this regime is that they're supposed to be self-sufficient, and yes, this is an incitement to make sure that those who come into the country as refugees find a job as quick as they can, and that they stay in work. So looking at the basics here, and it's actually a contradiction. What Denmark tries is to promote skilled workers coming to the country. That's their objective. So just like most European countries, Denmark depends on immigration to fill in posts, and they try to do agreements with African countries to convince skilled staff to go for a career in Denmark. So international students, even there are programs run by the government, and for certain groups of highly skilled, highly qualified people. So for certain groups, Denmark just try to make things easier having them to come to Denmark and staying. So Denmark is quite attractive when it comes to labor migration, especially because of the work-life balance, the labor conditions, payment, etc. Internations, that's what I call. I think they do surveys amongst expats. So Denmark's doing well when it comes to category of, let's say, working conditions, the revenue that can be generated when you live in Denmark. So Denmark scores very highly. However, they score very poorly ever since 2019 when you're looking at other indicators. Ease of settling in index, that was one index, the local friendliness. Or do people feel welcome in the country? And here Denmark scores very poorly. Most Nordic countries do. Denmark's doing even worse in many aspects. I'm not sure whether this is to do with the shift in paradigms, but of course, if you create a heated atmosphere and make people believe that refugees are not welcome, and there's ghetto legislation turning against people with a Western background. But it's hard to say whether this has to do with the migration that they want to have, that this kind of migration is impacted.
Ja, vielen Dank. Hier kam noch mal
Thank
die
you very
Frage
much.
zu der Ghetto-Gesetz.
There was another question on the so-called ghetto legislation.
Judikative, also die Gerichte eigentlich.
So what about Danish courts? How do they handle these acts, these laws? Do we have case laws? Actually, we see this at the European Court of Human Rights, that former inhabitants of, I think, one of the first quarters of town, one of the first areas called Area for Transformation or of Transformation, and some of the inhabitants turned to the European Court of Human Rights. And I think it's pending, or it started actually. Proceedings have started for about a month ago, but we haven't seen a sentence yet, no ruling yet. But actually they stand quite a chance to win the case. This is incompatible with EU law. But what's going to happen afterwards, I wouldn't know whether or not Denmark revokes this law. But there is very clear communication on that. Individual politicians in Sweden as well, they're insisting to take over this model from Denmark. So I think it's important to just wait for the ruling. I have an inkling that it'll be in favor of the former inhabitants of these areas.
Hier gibt's noch mal eine Verständnisfrage.
Just checking questions, and somebody couldn't quite understand what the Ghetto Act was. You might see it yourself in Slido. Let me read it out. So Danish citizens with a non-Danish background might be relocated as a consequence, ultimately. So how long does that reach back? My mother is German and my father is Arab. So if I lived in Denmark and my mum was Danish, would I have to be relocated? Well, I can't answer this very specific question in this specific case, but there's a list of countries that are considered non-Western countries. Whether both parents must come from there, I don't know, or whether it's just one parent with non-Western roots. But as I said, there's a whole list of countries with the criteria. It's possible. As I said, citizens can be affected in Denmark. And let me just add one thing. In the so-called ghettos, what we see is a different kind of law. So if you commit a crime in these ghetto areas, you will be punished more severely than if you did the crime in another area. So it's a different kind of ruling of jurisdiction. So one question, the revoking of the protected status. At the beginning, you said that evaluating the situation in the country of origin was very important. So the question here was, who does this kind of assessment or evaluation? What bodies or authorities in Denmark are competent for that? Do they look at official statistics or what the embassies feel about it? Can you say a few words about that? Well, I can't really say specifically. So they regularly do this kind of evaluation at least once per year, which is more often than in many other countries. And the criteria are slightly different than in many other countries. The reason being that we've seen a slight improvement. You can find this wording in the text of the law that a temporary improvement of the situation will do to bring forward the argument that this person is no longer entitled to this protected status, that some areas in the country of origin might be safe temporarily. But critics say this does not correspond to international standards. We must listen to what international organizations say about that. It's a totally different evaluation or assessment than other countries do. And this is the point of criticism. It's much too easy to revoke the protected status. And moreover, we don't just see that in Denmark. It might well happen in other countries, in the Nordic states, that the situation at the country of origin is re-evaluated. But that doesn't happen very often, whereas in Denmark, this is done very often. So as a protected person, a person seeking protection, you really have to be afraid of losing that status because you don't know how often. And the non-strict criteria don't help people either. So a slight improvement will do in the country of origin, and that is the difference. I think that the criteria for evaluation are just so different from international organizations like the UN, for example.
Thank you very much, Jakob. There are more questions that I can see here. But I do believe that you gave us a good overview of the subject matter. And we'll certainly get back to some of the questions. I'd now like to welcome Hakan. Thank you for being amongst us, Hakan. We invited you quite late, and a whole lot is going on at the moment. So thank you very much for being here. Jakob just gave us a presentation on the situation in Denmark. We're now going to move on to the second part of our evening. We are now going to take a look at what the situation is like in Europe, and we look forward to 3 inputs now. I'm very pleased that Judith Kohlenberger is here this evening, migration researcher at the University of Vienna. Judith, you wrote a book that asks the question, what price we pay as a society for isolation and deterrence. And you take a look at the European values, solidarity and human rights, and you posit that they continue to be named, but that they are no longer valid for all. But you also describe strategies as to how to counter this new hardline. That is also more or less the title of your new book. Thank you for being here, and we look forward to your presentation. I too am happy to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me to this great webinar, and thank you, Jakob, for your input. You said quite a few things that I can add to. I also prepared a few slides that I'd like to share. Perhaps I can continue with what Jakob said at the end. And that is, of course, the question of the effects of this type of policy. And in my input, I would like to particularly speak about the European level, and perhaps I can also say something about Denmark's neighboring countries that are at least indirectly affected by this type of policy. So it's about migration political effects, but it's also going to be about societal effects. Because, of course, these societal areas cannot easily be separated one from another. Perhaps I can start off by saying a few things about this northern migration policy. Jakob already said quite a few things. It's interesting to take a look at the long-term effects of an attempted deterrence policy. Now, for migration researchers, this isn't surprising, and that is that the attempt of steering migration via deterrence often has undesired side effects. And this can be seen by looking at Danish politics. There's an interesting paper, for example, that shows that deterrence was given minimally, but especially has a selective effect, and perhaps not quite like Denmark would have wanted. Typically, more highly educated people tend to be deterred by these policies because these people have alternatives. They can simply go to other countries where they feel more welcome. But people with less education or no formal education, maybe because they didn't have access to education because of a war in their country of origin, well, these people tend to be deterred less by these types of policies because there aren't any alternatives. So there's sort of this boomerang effect which affects Denmark badly, because Denmark is of course also trying to attract highly skilled workers. What we also see, and that is the main effect of the Nordic immigration policy, is a displacement effect. And this, of course, is fuel for the downward competition. This deterrent effect of Danish migration policy only works to a certain degree, it has to be said, because in the direct neighborhood there have been other countries that absorb these migration flows that would have originally gone to Denmark. Germany is an example for this. So there's a displacement of routes and target countries, but in general this doesn't mean that fewer people pack up to go to Europe, which is obvious because changes to national policies don't lead to a change of behavior in the countries of origin. So there's a displacement within Europe. And this is something we've been observing for a number of years now, because the Northern European countries aren't the only ones that have attempted to make their policy more restrictive and to lower the standards in such a way that asylum seekers have to deal with poor conditions. There's other countries like Greece where a verdict has shown that the conditions are not in line with human rights. And then there's also countries like Hungary where the asylum law has pretty much been scrapped. And this means that the general migration policy is distributed on the remaining countries that adhere to the laws and that do try to implement asylum laws. I would say that Germany and Austria are still part of these countries. But this means that over the course of the last few years, these countries had to deal with more asylum applications. And the right-wing populists have recognized that this is a topic, and this has certainly been an increasing element in migration debates. At the same time, the Danish migration policy in its current form is difficult to imitate by other countries because of the geographical position plays an important role here. Countries directly after the Balkan route would not be able to implement this because they are often the first countries after this long journey of the refugees that receive asylum applications. I speak as an Austrian, because Austria is often, after Hungary, the first location where an asylum application can be logged. Now, Jakob already said it. If you dig a bit deeper into Danish migration policy, it is clear there's a whole lot of contradictions, which is often the case in migration policy. Because we also recognized that at the same time, there are increased recruitment efforts also towards African people. Denmark was one of the first countries that, ahead of the verdict a few weeks ago, provided a blanket status of protection for Afghani women. So that is also happening. If you say you want the Danish model, this would also have to be included. Who says A also has to say B. The Scandinavian integration policy is somewhat better than the German one in one aspect, because here the job first approach was chosen. This means that you do not first check that the people speak the language well and are only integrated into the labor market afterwards. No. Even people that only have little knowledge of Danish can find a job that at least is being forced as much as possible. But this only works because this focus on the language is less stringent, and because a lot of people are also speaking English at work in Denmark. This is not necessarily the case in Germany. And it also has to be said that for a long time now, Denmark has put a hold on the plans to treat applications in Rwanda. So here you could say, been there, done that. Denmark took a look at whether this can be done. And Denmark pretty much came to the conclusion that financially and timely speaking, this cannot be done. Now moving on to the other countries that perhaps haven't yet implemented restrictive policies. Well, there's the question of this new hard line. And I think Annette already spoke about this. What we can see here is that the migration debate has turned, especially in Germany. Well, within few weeks, you could sort of in real time see how much this migration debate has changed. And a lot of the political parties often say that they do not want to implement policies against the majority of the German population, because the majority wishes for a new hard line, and here they tend to refer to surveys. And this is somewhat difficult because I assume this would have to be proven in experiments, but I do assume that these surveys also measure the effects of this change of the migration debate. The question is, what exactly is being measured in these surveys if a majority states that the right to asylum is no longer topical? Now, what does this relate to, and what exactly do you measure here? And one factor is that since 2015, we look at migration through the prism of security. It's a pure security topic. Also, at a political level, it is a pure security topic. Let's, for example, think of migration summits in Brussels, or in the different countries holding the presidency. It's always the ministers of the interior that take part in these summits, not the justice ministers or the social ministers. It's always a topic for the interior ministers. And this, of course, means that one focuses on migration as a security topic. What we also observe, and Annette also alluded to this at the beginning, and this is something we call a regime shift.
Strukturelle, schon würde ich sagen seit Jahren vorhandene Problemlagen lösen soll, die eigentlich in der Sozialpolitik liegen, in der Wohnungspolitik, in der Bildungspolitik.
One attempts to solve problems through immigration policy that are to be found in other areas of policy.
Und gleichzeitig die Migrationspolitik, nämlich eine harte Migrationspolitik, lösen.
But instead, one says that a hardline migration policy is to solve other problems, as for example, problems when it comes to housing. But we do not pose the question whether migration could also be one of the solutions when it comes to housing. Migrants who come into our country don't only occupy houses, but also help building them. Or when it comes to the dentist debate, here too you could change the narrative and say, okay, if we do a whole lot of things well in our integration, then migrants aren't only the ones that take advantage of appointments, but also offer these. But this switch of narrative is no longer found in our debates. And this really shows how a lot of parties today decide to go down this populist route. Another narrative I recognize is this term of uncontrolled immigration. It is being said that uncontrolled migration takes place, but it hasn't been taking place for many, many years. Applying for asylum means control, because here there's a fair asylum procedure that is to determine whether a person should enjoy a status of protection. This is the opposite of uncontrolled immigration, where I no longer have any control as a national state. What we also observe is the following. If we take a look at the concrete measures since 2015 at a national and international level, well, in the area of asylum, it has to be said that over the last 9 to 10 years, there hasn't been any liberalization. On the contrary, there has been more restriction, more of a hard line, more isolation, more outsourcing fantasies, and more deterrence. And this type of isolation policy is something we can call a hungry beast, because hardship always requires more hardship. If these first restrictive measures weren't successful, then even more restriction is demanded, and even more. And it's always the powers on the right of the center, or it's the far-right parties that continue demanding this. And this, of course, leads to a shift of the debate in general.
Wir dürfen nicht vergessen, dass ja vieles dieser gekippten Migrationsdebatte angestoßen wurde durch konkrete Fälle
these debates were often triggered by concrete cases of radicalization and extremism. But none of the measures offer concrete solutions to these problems. These are bogus solutions and bogus debates, because none of these measures actually tackle the topic of extremism. Allow me to mention an example. You all remember
Münchner NS-Dokumentationszentrum. Das war ein österreichischer Staatsangehöriger.
Austrian citizen that attempted to commit a terrorist attack. And this was in 2015 when there was already border controls between Austria and Germany, and this person was an Austrian citizen and therefore made it over the border. And research says it clearly that radicalization, or most of the radicalization, doesn't take place amongst refugees of the first generation, but is much more common in the second or third generation. So all of these measures might make it more difficult to apply for asylum, but these measures offer few solutions when it comes to the actual problem of radicalization of especially younger people online. The hard line, however, and that is an important second point, that is a second level that perhaps we can speak about. This hard line that we experience in asylum policy doesn't remain purely in asylum policy and also doesn't stop at the borders. It also has effects on our societies.
Frank Wolf and Volker Heinz, Hinter Mauern.
Volker Heinz have a book in which they concretely refer to this. And I also conducted a whole lot of interviews for my book. And what we see are different aspects as to how this hard line is being tested along the borders. Is being studied, so to speak, but also has an effect on the center of our societies. When it comes, for example, to getting used to this new hardship. Also those that are responsible for the pushbacks are getting used to this new hardline and are therefore also being harder in its application, for example, when it comes to police dealing with demonstrations. This could also be seen in the US. It strengthens authoritarianism, and it also leads to an erosion of the rule of law. Especially in those countries where those seeking protection are struggling, well, here the rule of law is also suffering in other areas. Let's think of Hungary, for example. In Hungary, we see that the media freedom has also been put under great pressure. Or in Poland, for example, there are now discussions as to whether one should scrap asylum law. Here also the reproductive rights of women were cut. So we can see that this is sort of a slippery slope. That this generally has an effect on society at large.
What I could see fairly often, people lose trust in the state and its power to decide. These are people who are trying to help refugees, and at some point they really doubt, they're so desperate given the system, they no longer believe in the state's decisions, in the state itself, and they no longer believe that the state is there for the common weal to help people. And sometimes you could see this in the little thing. A person who's helping refugees, he said, well, when I park my car, I don't take things very seriously. You know, if it's not allowed to park my car there, I'll do so anyway. This might be just a ridiculous example, really, but it just goes to show that people lose trust. So, and this is a difference between liberal and illiberal democracy, looking at moral injury. So let's look at who is to exert this power against, or violence even against, refugees or people seeking protection under the refugee status. So who is the offender here, and what can that do to a society? people might feel they actually have to be unjust and they have no means or ways using the existing legal provisions. What Jakob said, I really like that very much, that they tried to empirically prove what we can see in many contexts, the fact that concepts of the extreme right, the radical right, or their terminology that the center parties have taken this over, it no longer weakens those at the extreme right, but it just makes these terms, these concepts normal. It brings them to the middle of the society, and this is why it's so important to take a very close look at what's happening with the political spectrum as a whole. It's not just about the fact that right extremist parties grow. Sometimes they have to actually, because the ideas and concepts are taken over by the centrist parties. So this is basically what we see. Let me give you an example from Austria. Just very recent, we have elections tomorrow, and 30 years ago in Austria, we had the Austria First referendum, and this is where a number of racist, xenophobic measures were demanded. That was in 92, so over 30 years ago, of the then FPÖ, the right-wing party, and the majority of those demands have been implemented, but not by the FPÖ, leading the government, by all other parties who were in governments ever since. So this could be a slippery slope. This could be the starting point of bringing such concepts to the middle of society. Let me point to a quotation that I think is very pertinent. So those who are fleeing, they should be marginalized, should be seen as a marginalized person in society. A refugee is at the centerpiece, or should be at the centerpiece of our political history as the human in terms of human rights. So it doesn't start with the established people in society. So these are part of society, they have their roots in society. It really starts with the marginal figures. So, and refugees are the very representatives of that group in our society. To conclude, let me show up some alternatives looking at the abstract, more philosophical level. Here I'm looking at a concept of Etienne Balibar, a French philosopher, who in the early days of our century said that the border regimes would be democratic if, when it comes to the right to obtain a visa, to immigrant, it was not only for those within those borders to decide, but to a certain extent, this decision should be left to those outside the borders, because they are concerned, partially at least, so co-decision both ways. And then a few more points. The challenges that we face. It would take demilitarization of borders to achieve more democratic regimes. But it's not an open borders argument, and this is what I should like to underscore, because in today's Europe, we also want to respect the borders of nation states and the sovereignty of nations. We do not want to seriously have an open border discussion. However, I do believe, looking at the binarity, so the dichotomy of either totally closed or totally open, we could create transparent borders, and there were very clear criteria of what makes them transparent. For example, in border regions, in Portugal, for example, or in Switzerland, we have institutionalized fora for dialogue. Roundtables were organized, for example, and the citizens also founded fora. Migrant organizations were on board as well. So everything is negotiated in a democratic manner. So this is just one stepping stone. What we see behind that is a new tier. This is so-called democracy research when it comes to looking into border policies. People are asked for their principles or ideas. Judith, just very briefly, let me interrupt you. I know that Hakan is only available until 8:30. He really has to leave us. This is the very last slide. I didn't want to interrupt, but just for you to bear that in mind. I just sent a message. I think you haven't seen that. Thank you. So it's the very last slide, and I don't want to go into detail, but we've been talking about a very abstract idea. And let me mention a few very tangible, very specific measures, and I think this will help Hakan to chip in, because we're looking at policies, tangible policies. Looking at the second point here, the bullet point, I believe that a number of these fantasies of isolating people, well, in most member states of Europe, I'm very pragmatic. These 2 points are fair asylum procedures under the rule of law. We don't have that in all member states in Europe. Far from it. And housing for refugees and those seeking protection under decent conditions to avoid the competition. It sounds maybe trivial, but perhaps we should start where we lack rules, or we have too little right to asylum. So we have a deficit, I think, in implementation, so the older rules are no longer used, they're discarded. So this would be a point to start with, perhaps. And I'm closing here, and I'm very happy to hear your questions. Looking forward to the discussion. Thank you. Judith, thank you very much. Now, you gave us a wonderful ground to walk on, especially for Hakan. Hakan, very happy to have you. You're a member of the Committee of the Interior and co-chair of the SPD group in the German Lower House of Parliament in the Bundestag. Now, migration, integration policy legislation was very often discussed in the Bundestag. It's one of the areas in which the most legislative work has been done. Think of the reform of the citizenship law, for example, or the Skilled Workers Immigration Act. And you did explain this quite nicely. Now, we saw a very constructive approach, and hardly anything is left. We're talking about security packages, payment cards, etc. What is the political level discussion? What kind of debates or discussions do you have in Neukölln, in Berlin, in your constituency? Thank you very much for having me. Thank you, Judith, for your contribution. And thank you for the book you've written. I enjoyed reading your book. I think this is a very good contribution to the debate. And I've mentioned your book in one of my speeches, and I share your analysis that we do see a new hard line taken in society. And I'm a critic of that. I voice criticism very often. It's not a closed room with over 700 people. This is a public meeting. And it's nothing new that I'm a critic. Let me give you an example. Last year, I think it was in September, I was having a conversation with NTV, a German TV chain, with the question, what about extending border controls? And the SPD at the time said, no, this is not going to work. We don't have the staff amongst those forces, and it did not have an effect. And my speaker for political issues said the same. I think they were having an interview in the room next door. But then only 2 weeks later that the position was a different one within the party. So if in 2012, 15 or 16 or 17, you had asked me if at some point the Social Democrats will carry out so-called smart border controls or border checks, full stop, to start with, I would have thought, no, we're not going to see that, are we? But this is the very situation we're in now. Perhaps we see a shift of that discussion, of that debate in society. I see that, I hear that, and this is what I communicate within the group. And many share that. Now, looking at the substantial points. Now, to make sure not to muddle up things, you have to say that the security package and also GEARS was brought forward by the same government that brought about very progressive measures, not perfect, but progressive, changing the citizenship law at a level that the United States and Canada have. Wow. So dual citizenship for everybody, that was unthinkable before. The right for the resident under equal opportunities. This is something that we started, and many other progressive points like to abolish the law on transsexuals. So a number of laws have been adopted, but also a security package, just to give it a complete picture. But you can't say that everything became obsolete because of you introducing the security package. Well, you can say that, of course. I don't think so. I think we mustn't confuse things here. In Neukölln, or generally speaking, in our society, a doctor, for example, in the Vivantes hospital in Berlin will ask me, will I be deported? Or young people who just go to school, they turn to me and ask me, will I be deported? This brings great unrest in our society. Perhaps so much on the substantial issues. What I would like to focus on, I'm reading all sorts of things, articles, essays, and all sorts of contributions. But I'm still looking an answer to a question. In Parliament, I'm just one representative member of Parliament out of 733. So in the best case scenario, I need 369 members of Parliament here. And you will see this is not going to work. With the very best argument, it does not work. This works via other theories of mobilizing people within a group, a political group. I don't need my group only, I need the Greens and the Liberals, the FDP. So I'm bumping into a wall. Perhaps I can convince 35 members of my group. They might be critical voices against the security package. However, more than that, 105 or 510. So how do I reach the number of 300 members of parliament that have a critical view on that? So what about the pressure within civil society? I don't think it's the civil society's responsibility only, certainly not. At the beginning of the year with the democratic movements, they made a major difference. It really did make a difference. The AfD, the white extremists, have gone down from 23% to 17%. So it has had an impact. But we can feel it, of this pressure in society. We get a great number of emails. Things are happening in the streets. And this is when I can feel that my colleagues in various groups, they get a move on without me being able to give you specific figures, or it's not that I'm the one telling the best narrative, but I'm a great fan of the civil society working with politics, with the anti-Semitism resolution. Let me say there's a number of scientists, 1,600 of them, or 2,000 even, who provided drafts. Still speaking from my perspective here, we didn't receive those drafts via email. It was not cooperation proper, but you can send us emails, just give us, Christian name, point name at bundestag.de. So all members of parliament will receive that via our email distributor, but this has not happened. So, and that's when I said, look, we should be interlinked a lot more. It wasn't a major problem. I'm not a FAZ reader, I can still find an article of that newspaper. But, you know, cooperation with civil society from our political side, this needs to be strengthened. That's an important point. The narrative, yes, of course, when I give a speech, I will not speak of the umpteenth person with a migration background, they did something wrong. I talk about the truth, the reality, the fact that the great majority is different. I tell stories like that, and it's important. Not many people do that, not even in my group, sadly, but do tell positive stories that people will remember. That's a very important aspect. And one last point. Sometimes I feel that this shift in our debate is somehow a natural process. Well, yes, it is. The parties at the center, they do take that up, but ever since 2013 and then with the radicalization as of 2050, we have a right extremist party within our system of parties, and they receive 100 million euro per year to continue influencing society and changing the debate, and to make sure that things that usually you wouldn't say, they're not acceptable, they become normal. So that's a strategy of a party, and they find their way into society, at least temporarily at the moment. So let me state quite clearly, it's not a solution, but I am part of the 37 members of parliament who said that let's have our constitutional court check whether the AfD corresponds with our rule of law. I know there is a number of publication of books on that, and they say that, you know, the court might say that the AfD goes against human dignity. Our constitutional court should have the right to verify this. This should be an instrument, a very important one, but this won't do. And as Judith said, we need good, solid politics in any field, be it housing or social matters, social affairs, pension payments. And the same goes for my group. I keep asking myself why we try sort of regaining control only within the area of migration and immigration, but when it comes to rents for apartments, etc., or financial questions, nobody would speak of control. So that is strange, I find. And also when it comes to our language and our actions, it's important that we point to things that go wrong, of course, but it's important to use respectful terms in our language, respect human rights. 2021, the FDP, the Liberals, I feel were successful because they were very credible in that. But at the moment, I feel that people no longer believe us, given the various styles in politics, and this is something we need to change, and that is something I'm working on. One last sentence, perhaps Judith said what she was talking about ideas. No, I'm not a fan of gas, but we will have the implementation law. But this is the reaction, the answer to a question that we've heard for 20 years. So, meaning that all European countries have the same system. We have the same conditions for Greece. In Greece, you don't get any benefits for the first 5 years, even after having been recognized refugees in our joint asylum system. But we'll only see this joint system in 2026. And this is what Judith said as well. So we see more strict measures. Thank you.
Ich habe kurz, danke dir. Ich schalte mich mal kurz ein, weil Annette gesagt hat, ich stelle dir mal die Rückfrage, weil ich hier durch die Fragen auch.
I took a look at the questions that are being posed. Hakan, the last thing you said was very important. You spoke about the topic of gaining control being mentioned in the area of migration, but not so much in the area of social policy. And indeed, social democratic parties are also elected by people that used to vote right-wing parties if they do social policy. And then the people who elect this party place less importance on migration. The coalition government also did quite a bit. But perhaps you could say a few more things about this connection before you leave, because in my opinion, this is quite important when it comes to the connection between social security and accepting the situation that migration exists. I'm not sure if I'm going to say what you want me to say. You're right. The less we speak about migration, generally speaking, the better it is. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't tackle issues. We know that AfD has a sort of issue ownership, and this is hard to take away from them. So you're right, Hakan, when you say, Hakan, why aren't you speaking about pensions? Why aren't you speaking about finances?
Ganz normaler Bestandteil dieser Gesellschaft ist. Auf jeden Fall.
Why aren't we speaking about migration being a normal part of our society? This is something I also see in my constituency. There's a whole lot of topics, such as rent prices. But for some reason, we aren't really managing to discuss this in the media, because the AfD and the CDU does have the strategy to constantly focus on this topic. And it is true that we are challenging to really talk about other areas in such a way that the media also focuses on it. We also have the suggestion that 1% of the richest Germans should pay more taxes. That's a great policy, and it stays in the media for a couple of days, and then that's it. So this begs the question, how can we ensure that other topics also make it to the fore in the media?
Also wir beeinflussen ja auch die Umfragen und die Umfragen beeinflussen uns. Also ich würde nie sagen,
we have an influence on the surveys and the surveys also influence us. I would never say that I'm going to do it like the surveys say. We also have the responsibility to be a part of the plurality of opinion within societies, and this can also be changed by providing arguments, by taking part in discussions. In my constituency in the south, I spend times in bars as well, and then I speak about the topics we're discussing here as well, with a lot of respect. And after speaking about migration for a few minutes, typically we tend to speak about things such as waste disposal or pensions. But we also have to go into these places. These don't always have to be bars or pubs, but having discussions based on respect is very important. And then even people that vote center-right will have the feeling that there's someone here who cares about us and that the topics are important. Back to Annette. Hakan, I know you have 4 minutes left. Perhaps one more question. Are you hopeful that things are going to change over the next months, that the discourse is going to change? We'll have to wait for this week. We have this anti-Semitism resolution, which is also going to be somewhat critical.
Glaube ich, in der Politik sein, wenn ich nicht daran glauben würde, dass sich Sachen ändern.
I am a politician because I believe that change is possible.
Dass etwas Positives entstehen kann.
I do believe that something positive can ensue.
Und ich habe in meinem Wahlkreis, in der Gesellschaft viele Menschen, die
in my constituency, There are many people that do great work, that show a lot of respect, that offer help to children in education. And there are many people that do not want this new hard line within our society, people that want to have a style of politics that takes everyone on board. And this gives me hope. And I want to contribute to this, so I am optimistic, and I also have to be optimistic.
Okay, ja, super Schlusswort. Hakan, wir entlassen dich. Ich weiß, du bist busy und hast
a great closing remark. I know you're busy and that you have another appointment, so thank you very much for now.
Genau.
Bye-bye, and I wish you all a great webinar.
Last but not least,
Last but not least, I would now like to give the floor to Nursemin Sönmez. You are a representative of civil society. The post-migrant network really represents civil society. The question, of course, is how can civil society exert pressure and what can be done? But before we move on to possible solutions, perhaps the following question: how do you perceive the discussion? How is this being discussed within your network? You stand up for an inclusive Germany. Now, how do you discuss these questions against this background? Thank you. I'm Nursemin Sönmez. I prepared a small input, but I will shorten it because, as has already been said, this will give us more time for our debate. I prepared input from the post-migrant perspective, and when it comes to the discussion about solutions, I'll perhaps say more about this. We, as a new German organization, are a post-migrant network consisting of 200 members in Germany. A lot of younger initiatives and organizations are also part of our network. If I take a look at the restrictions and the political developments, I of course take a look at this from a post-migrant perspective, with a view of the fact that society at large is marked by immigration. And the starting basis is already that we have a diverse society. Before I speak about restrictions, I would like to say the following. We've always had immigration in this country, and immigration is a part of our history. My parents are from Turkey, for example, or we had contract workers that also came to Germany. We also have migration because of wars, as is the case at the moment with the war in Ukraine. We had immigrants that were suffering from repression in their countries. There's also immigration because of love. Family reunification, for example, is another reason that makes people migrate. And then we also have the migration of season workers. And then we also have work-related immigration. So despite the restrictive policies, there are a lot of people coming over to Germany to work. That is perhaps the starting point when it comes to observing the reality we find ourselves in. It is important to repeat in what society we find ourselves and what our history is. Now, Judith mentioned the restrictions. So did Jakob. And what are the effects on migration policy? What are the effects on the German society? This too has already been said. What we can observe is one thing, which is an important aspect, and that is that we need a human rights-based migration policy and also develop tools for this. Now, this seems simple, but that is the path we have to go down. And we are far away from this at the moment. And this isn't pessimism. As a civil society, we must maintain optimism despite of these difficult times we find ourselves in. Now, the common European asylum policy has already been mentioned, with reforms that are very restrictive, that also violate human rights to a certain degree.
Auf der deutschen Ebene in Deutschland immer wieder als die Legitimation genutzt wurde, dass der Rechtsdruck
in Germany, this is being used to legitimize the parties that suggest the restrictive policies. This could be seen during the elections in Eastern Germany. That even established parties started using right-wing populist language. And when we speak of restrictive policies, well, this often also leads to social exclusion. It is important to stress this, that this political development also has an effect on other political decisions, also when it comes to the social level. This is something we experienced when it came to the payment cards for refugees, when no cash is being paid. This too is a social restriction. Then there's the dire situation in the accommodations, which is also worth mentioning. These restrictions aren't new. Looking back 30 years ago, we had the asylum compromise. And we had Article 16a, which came into force. So there are repeated restrictive instruments such as these neighborhood agreements too, which serve to curtail immigration. These agreements, for example, that we have with Turkey. And I also already mentioned the discourses and the debates. And this doesn't only go for the AfD, of course it's also the AfD, but also we see that the established parties are elaborating anti-refugee sentiment. We experienced restrictive policies in February with a law for the improvement of deportations. That too is one of the restrictive developments we have observed. And there's also the security package, which was already mentioned today as well. And this too was a reaction to the events in Solingen. We see this regularly, that windows of opportunities are used to bring into force restrictive laws.
Somit auch wieder auf der sozialen Ebene eine Exklusion darstellt.
So then this leads to exclusion at a social level too. In summary, we're experiencing a restriction to the right to asylum. Human rights are being stripped, and the main goal, and this has already been said hitherto, the main goal is to prevent migration to Germany. It's all about ensuring that this right isn't taken advantage of. The goal is to simplify deportations and, like I said beforehand, social restrictions and exclusion to do too.
GAS-Reform. Ich komme dann auch schon zum Schluss.
And this brings me almost to the end. Now, what tools can be established here? What policy can be used? Perhaps I can present this in a simplified fashion. It has been mentioned beforehand that fair procedures are required. We need a human rights monitoring. We need tools that help in the area of accountability. And if these rights of people seeking protection are violated, this also has to have consequences. This is something I constantly stress to ensure that these debates are had in such a way that these things are considered. And this was also said during the inputs beforehand. We're experiencing a debate that is shifting more and more to the right. right-wing extremist language is being used, and this means that facts are losing importance, and we have to ensure that people who come to Germany do not find themselves in a competition with the local population. Hakan and Judith also spoke about this.
Dargestellt werden von uns, der Zivilgesellschaft, aber auch der Politik, dass das keine Verteilungskonflikte sind, die von den Bürgerinnen aus.
We need to ensure that this isn't something that should lead to a conflict. Migration policy shouldn't be seen as a security policy, but as a social policy, as a labor market policy, as educational policy, and this has to be focused on within the debates. So it is seen as a lack of resources within our societies, and that it isn't solely treated as a topic relating to migration or migrants. And when we speak of migration policies and we speak about regulating migration policy, it's always important to speak of the security from the perspective of the migrants, to focus on this. When I spoke about legitimization, it was, well, we see that it's typically about how this affects the white local populace, but it's important to also see this from the perspective of the migrant population. And that is also why it is important to speak about the insecurity within these debates.
Genau, und hier geht es auch die Sorgen, Betroffenheit, Ängste und
it's also about the worries and the desire for security, also from the perspective of the migrants, migrants that either come to Germany or are already in Germany. And when we take a look at the effects at a national level, well, at a national level, we need to prioritize the protection of refugees. We need to speak about the right to remain. We need to speak about anti-discrimination, anti-racism through fair procedures or anti-racism policy. Okay, at this point, I'll perhaps stop.
Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank.
Well, thank you so much. That was very exhaustive. The comments and questions show me that people are enthusiastic. They love your contributions. So I think we've all learned an awful lot. Like what you reported, what you told us, especially on the ghetto legislation. I'm not sure whether we should actually use that term, parallel societies and people relocated. Looking at the number of people's question here, just imagine from a German perspective, the idealists who set a limit saying 40 or 50% of this or that, you enjoy certain rights or you don't. So I was really shocked. It reminded me of the Third Reich. So what's the percentage of, are you a Jew, 100%, 50% or 25%? And I think this really touches people. It's outrageous, really. For me personally, I think this is overstepping a certain mark. Marion, for example, calls it an apartheid system. Maybe we're not there yet, but perhaps I could ask you. I can't remember who asked that question, but what's the discussion in Denmark? You know, we looked at the civil society in Germany and what role does it play? So how do people see that in Denmark? What does civil society have to say about this kind of legislation?
Ja, also das ist ein bisschen unterschiedlich, ob man jetzt über die politische Diskussion spricht oder wie du sagst,
those are two different cans of worms, the political discussion and the civil society. There is resistance within civil society, especially amongst associations who work for the rights of refugees and migrants, also women's rights associations. So there are people who, despite the fact they're citizens, enjoy fewer rights than other Danish citizens, given their origin. There are a certain category of origin. So it's almost cynical. Let me tell you an anecdote. There was a member of the AFD delegation who went to look at this ghetto model in Denmark, and we saw an article in a major paper, the Zeit, quoting this AFD member. So this person was taken by the hand by somebody who was relocated several times, and this person said, well, yes, it's very difficult making that differentiation, Western or non-Western background person or citizen. So even for a member of the AFD, it seemed a little radical at first sight. You'd think they'd like it, but it does show, I think it does demonstrate that it goes into that direction. We're moving away from human rights standards. So that would be my personal feeling, my evaluation. But looking at the political level, so yes, there are people protesting in civil society. I think many people aren't actually aware of what's going on. The majority of the Danish population does not have a non-Western background to show off. They're not mobilized, they're not concerned, so they wouldn't know much about it either. However, looking at the political discussion, we see no objections, really. There are no parties who say they're against. There is a spectrum. The range green left, they're slightly against it, but actually they agree. All parties agree. There's consensus in a way. Indeed, the ghetto legislation, and that term is horrible, I agree, is a good example for that. So parties amongst each other agree. So apartheid regime, I'm not sure whether I'd like to call it that, but there are colleagues of mine in Denmark who do use that term for Denmark, ghetto politics or ghetto legislation, because this is a helplessness that people don't know a way out of. There's nothing you can do really to personally change anything in the system, or to, get to a situation when you can take your life into your own hands as an immigrant. There's hardly any political discussion, no debate, and this goes very far now. So a positive, transparent, open communication to the outside. They're not hiding the fact that they're treating people with a non-Western background differently from people with a Western background or Western roots. So you'd even, between the lines, say that they're proud of it. A few months ago, we heard a speech by a member of parliament in the Danish parliament, a Democratic Party actually, who said it's not enough for people not to be criminals and that they're working in Denmark, but we need to be suspicious as a rule of people with a certain ethnicity. Although they might seem harmless, they undermine the state and infiltrate state institutions. And this was just a single speech by a politician, but it was supported by his party members, and this is a very extreme form of nationalism. So it's no longer about migration politics and the hard line that is taken, the toughening. This goes even further, and at local level, at local political level, you might see resistance. There might be parts of certain political parties at local level who say, no, we're against this concept, but not on national level. Thank you. Just a few words or question on civil society, and perhaps I could ask Judith Kohlenberger to again show the last slide offering a solution. But Nursemin, what you said, and this ties in with Hakan, looking at the civil society. Now, your organization, for example, how do you work with churches churches. Those would be the largest civil society organizations that exist in most countries. And I think this is true for Germany as well, although the churches lose membership. So both great strands do have something like a church asylum. At the end of the month, we'll have a webinar on that because we see different developments here. But what is the cooperation like between the post-migrant organizations and the churches in Germany? Well, let me say the following. In recent years, but even before, but in recent years, especially with right extremism and AfD becoming stronger and being present in a number of alliances, and churches might be part of that, for example, the Alliance for Democracy, that would comprise them. So we're very active. And we have, as I said, church players in these groups. Let me think. There are no bilateral negotiations or talks with churches or their representatives, but within those alliances we are. And of course, when we hear statements, for example, yes, of course we cooperate, but that would be a civil society level, that we talk to one another, and we just try and see how can we come up with a strong joint statement to provide some counter pressure. So as a German perspective, I have friends who work in these organizations, and within churches there is insatisfaction. People are not happy with the fact that churches do not speak up. And let me ask Judith Kohlenberger, because Austria, historically, the Catholic Church especially, plays a very strong role. I don't mean to criticize churches or anything, but I think this is an interesting question. Perhaps you could have a word or two to say on that. Well, let me say the following. Perhaps first of all, in Austria, the right populist positions is something we do not only find within migration. We find them as a normal concept in all other areas for decades now. And this is not like Germany, where we even saw companies voicing their criticism of the AfD, and this is just unthinkable in Austria because the right extremists have become part of the new normal. I'm not saying this as a menacing scenario, it's just a fact. So what we see is that on the one hand, the local level integration work is done to a large part by church organizations or churches or associations that are in close cooperation with churches. Yes, we see that, but fewer and fewer people would voice that very openly. So I wonder in what way the new hard line finds its way into the inner parts of society. When talking to people personally, I hear that people who were in groups that help refugees, they said, well, I'm now into different kinds of social work, for example, with a handicap, with the disabilities, because that is more acceptable in society than working with refugees. Or some people would hide their work, for example, in the rural areas, people know each other, and then they would be at the local pub and would have to justify their work for refugees, meaning that social cohesion suffers. It's really put to the test, looking at the overall picture. So yes, churches do play a role, but looking at the representatives of the religious communities, they find less and less support. The Catholics, bishops, conference, etc. Behind the scenes, I hear that, well, we don't know what we can do with this argument, with this debate. How can we do anything constructive? It lacks imagination. Well, this is a great bridge to the top question, Rainer Bonnet. You point to the fact quite rightly that immigration is discussed only in a negative sense. How can we overcome this negative narrative and turn it around? For example, in Bonn, if all bus drivers would be deported because they have a migration background, there would be no buses running. So how can we turn the narrative? That's a very good question, but let me add a question to that. So you asked, how can we turn the narrative around? And I will ask, is there a society that managed to do so, that succeeded? Canada, for example, is a favorite. We hear a lot about of Canada. So is there any good examples? Judith Kohlenberger first.
Ich sage etwas, was vielleicht
well, I'll be saying something that sounds difficult to digest, but looking at this downhill journey we're in with political demands, I think we will see some things getting worse before they get better, because the trend will continue at European level, I'm afraid. It's not just isolation and deterrence, it's also relocation, the idea that refugees shouldn't be here in the first place. What we don't see is not going to give us any worry. So I don't think there is room for maneuver. So let me come back to my slide. Here I gave a few ideas that might be helpful. No, a deficit in implementation, this is what I pointed to, so that would be very important, and that would make sure that borders would be areas where we find rights being implemented, rights being enforced. So that's important to look at what we have in terms of acquis. I think it's very difficult, let's say here at Europe Calling seminars, we voice criticism of the European asylum policies and the reform of the European system, but we still need more European cooperation in this field than less. It's still better than no cooperation. So a European form of migration policy is what is needed, something that's more European. So the Schengen area should become that what it was. That it's basically it's a pillar. It's the foundation of the European project, European integration. So not stop people, but to promote the freedom of movement. So Schengen would be a part of the solution. And there are approaches in that direction. And I believe that at the moment, it's not a good idea to begin again at zero with the joint European asylum system. I think that would make things even more complex. We should work with what we have. So I think it's a positive approach that it had been codified. Yes, all 27 member states committed themselves to solidarity. In what way this is filled with life? Flesh to the bones, that is a different question, but the Austrian Migration Commission member is obliged and has committed to implementing what it says on paper, and it doesn't have to start with the border proceedings or isolation. It's also about the fact that every single member state lives up to their responsibility in terms of asylum procedures, that they take ownership. So we should focus on aspects where there is still some leverage, still some room for maneuver. It sounds very pragmatic, I know, and I think this is exactly what we need. We need to be pragmatic. And what goes hand in hand with that, I think, is that this menacing scenario is curbed. And that last question, what would be a counter-narrative, or how can this narrative be turned around? I think at some point reality will overtake us, so to speak. It will convince us, because ever more areas us in Europe will see that the migration crisis is not the greatest crisis we're facing, but a crisis of democracy. And we've seen the signs. We're not really in the middle of things. We're not in the middle of the hurricane, but almost all labor markets in Europe say that they severely lack skilled staff, skilled workers. So refugees, if we want to deter them, but we would like to have other migrants join us. I think those who are willing to migrate, this is the message they get, that part of their group is rejected. I think we have to walk on eggshells here. Be very careful. People do not need protected status because they might be workers in the new countries. But on the other hand, I think people want to contribute to and participate in the society they live in by working in that society. So I think the pressure will be increasing, the pressure to take action. So it'll be harder to strictly go against immigration, but within the migration movements to Europe, I think we will see greater, we will want greater differentiation. You know, we can't say this is the bad group, this is the good group. So we have Afghanistan or Syria, refugees from there, and then there's another group from elsewhere. It's a question about access to Europe, and we need to strengthen the debate at European level, because with the European consensus, we could cut down on competition. And a policy brief, you will find everything in detail. Indeed, and there's an excellent podcast on that.
Und dem Delors Center, das war auch sehr spannend.
Of the Delors Center, we heard that today. If you're interested. I think you mentioned a very important term here. That, you know, the policy of finding a scapegoat, that migration, refugees, people with a migration background, they're scapegoats for anything that might happen in the various countries. And I think this ties in with what Hakan said. And let me ask Nursemin, I think you touched upon this, but we have another minute. Perhaps we could be more specific here. From your point, how can we escape from that scapegoat policy? The 100,000 euro question at the end. Yes, what will you pay me if I give you an answer? I think Judith partially answered your question. Our way out is by not joining the debate. This kind of policy keeps being legitimized by saying, well, we need to curb right extremism, so we will go for a more restrictive immigration politics, because we hear people. We hear what they say. We hear what the majority of the population say. So I think this is a very important point. Let's look at what's behind these discussions. And what we also heard, the labor market policy and social policy should be not the only aspect in this debate. And there's a new German organization. All I can say is that neue Organisation, that anti-racist initiatives should be strengthened so that they, again, are strengthened to provide their statements. And it's important to have the resources. Of course, we have these debates at various levels. So what kind of options do we have at the political level as a civil society? What I've recently noticed also amongst trade unions, organizations, was what does strike mean? Let's say descendants of migrants, people that are concerned by racism, if they went on strike, what would that mean in Germany for one day? I think in the supermarket they took out certain products. Perhaps we could look at things from that perspective. What would be our power if we went on strike for one day? So it's a very important point to strengthen civil society and bring it into the co-decision process.
Da sind die Stahlkocher ganz viele
Germany's biggest steelworks is about 20 kilometers from here. And if there was a strike there, it would surely stop being operational. We're now at the end of our event. I would like to thank everyone who was there today. There's still 500 attendees that listened to us for 2 hours. It was very interesting. Many important points that give us a lot of food for thought. There were also great questions from the audience. I do hope that we were able to reply to a lot of the questions. So yes, it was very interesting. I'd also like to thank our 2 interpreters for their work, which certainly wasn't easy. And I wish all of us that we managed to shift this narrative and that perhaps we contributed to this a little bit today. And as Judith Kohlenberger said, things always get worse before it gets better. I do hope that this time of getting worse will be as short as possible and that we manage this turnaround. And we've heard a lot of great suggestions as to how this can work out today. Our next webinar will be on the climate conference when it takes place in a couple of weeks, and then at the end of November we're going to have a webinar with the Protestant Church in Germany with regards to church asylum. We'll be sending through the links. So I wish all of you a great evening. I do hope you'll be able to have a good evening after this discussion, and see you next time at Europe Calling.